Hey, welcome Power Platform friends. I have a fun video series that I'm creating here for all of you to learn more about Power Platform Application Lifecycle Management, or ALM for short. So what is that? Well, ALM means everything involved with taking your app from where it starts, where you develop it, to the location where you need to test it, and then ultimately to where you're going to let your users use it, which we typically call a production environment. So there's many different ways that you can do this in Power Platform, and I've created a large video series here to show you how to do all these things and get pretty in-depth with it. So in this first video, the one you're watching right now, I'm going to walk you through what your options are with Power Platform ALM. And then in subsequent videos, I'll walk you through each one of those options and show you how to use it, or point you toward places that show you how to use it if it's real simple. But I think you're going to be really impressed on what you can do with the new Power Platform pipelines, as well as with Azure DevOps pipelines and the Power Platform build tools to create ALM in your organization. So buckle up your seatbelts and hold on. This is going to be a lot of good stuff, and I can't wait to share it with everyone. Thanks for watching. So as we go through this video today, what I'm first going to show you is what all the options are for Power Platform, and then I'll show you the pros and cons for each, and then we'll compare them side by side on many different factors, and hopefully this will give you the information you need to decide which one works best for you and your organization. Something I'd like you to keep in mind as you listen to this video along the way too is that you may have a short-term plan for ALM and a long-term plan. And I think a lot of organizations may fall into this category. So keep it in mind on what you might use to start and what you may be aiming for down the road, because I think you probably have two plans the more you think about it. So what are these options? Well, the options are as follows. We can do manual ALM between the different environments, which is basically working within the web browser and clicking a bunch of things and typing stuff. The next option is Azure DevOps pipelines. Within the Azure DevOps pipelines, we can call the Power Platform build tools for Azure DevOps to do things like import a solution, export a solution, pull it out of an environment and add it to source control even. We can also call PowerShell, which means we can call the PowerShell commandlets that Microsoft writes to interact with Power Platform. And we can also call our own PowerShell if we need to do things that what Microsoft is providing us in the build tools or their PowerShell commandlets don't meet the needs of. Then we have the new Power Platform pipelines. These just went into preview publicly a few days ago. I've been really excited and fortunate to have been working on them for a few months now in the private preview. So I've got some great demos all ready to go with those to demonstrate all their capabilities. The ALM Accelerator for Power Platform is also another ALM option. This is an open source option Microsoft provides, and I'll get into more about it later. It's an excellent tool to use for learning, extremely robust set of capabilities as well. And then there's also a hybrid option. Maybe you're going to do part of this one way, and maybe you're going to do part of it another. Maybe, like I said, you have a plan that evolves from maybe in the short term it's manual, and long term you use Power Platform pipelines. That could be a possibility too. Maybe at some point you're using one of one and one of another. And so that's what I would like to call the hybrid, and I certainly see many folks taking that approach right now already. So as we look at the manual approach, this is really for one-person teams, in my opinion, or unique situations where this is your best fit. To do this, you can see in the screenshots here, I use the Power Platform admin and maker portals to manually perform all the ALM tasks. I export and import solutions between environments. I create all the connections in the different environments. I create their environment variables and manually set up all their valuables. And then I edit the solutions to use the proper connections and point them to the right connection in each environment I deploy them to. So that's in a nutshell what you do as part of a manual deployment. And I'll get into some more about that in the subsequent videos. Now, what's good and bad about that? Well, the good is there's really no setup required at all for the manual approach. This is really a good fit for situations where you only need to deploy a limited amount of Power Platform solutions. Maybe there's just one or two. Maybe you're a small company and you just got one or two Power Apps or flows, and that's it. This is a great fit for you then. This also works really well for infrequent deployments where you don't really need to automate it. I mean, if you're in a really big company and you've got a big team of developers churning on Power Apps all the time and cranking out version 1, version 2, version 3 every few weeks, you're not going to want to go the manual route. But if you're a company that purchased the Power App from somebody or you developed it yourself and you just need to move it from your development to your production environment, it's the only one your company's got, it's only going to happen one time, well, this manual might be the best fit for you then too. Now, the cons of it is tedious. I mean, the bigger your solution gets and the more that it relies on as prerequisites, the more tedious it becomes. For example, imagine you have a Power Platform solution that has a flow, a Power App, and it talks to two different SharePoint lists, and they're on two different SharePoint sites. So to set that up in each environment, you would have to create all those things and the connections to them and then wire them up appropriately in your Power App. It can take a long time. On the other hand, if you use some of these other approaches, it may only take a second to deploy that SharePoint list versus all the clicks you would do it manually. But again, keep in mind when this approach is good and bad, and just an example of how this approach can be tedious. So as I mentioned, it's slow. There's nothing automated. This approach goes as fast as you can click and type. It's inconsistent because humans do it, right? We all make mistakes. We never do everything perfect every single time. So that's why this approach is consistent, because it has that human manual element in it. Therefore, it's error prone. Now, those go hand in hand. Now, the source control, there is no source control for this. You're basically, the way you would do source control here is you would keep a copy of the zip file of the solution that you're importing and exporting in between environments, and that's your source control. Pretty crude. As you'll see, other ways we can do it with the DevOps and things like that gives us full, robust source control where we can look at version history and who changed what and exactly what in the code changed. But that's not possible with the manual approach. Now, managed solutions may also be impossible to work with in certain situations. And a situation like that would be that you need to deploy your your solution to a new environment and it has a Power App in it. But the only way to change the data source that Power App is connected to is to edit the Power App. In such a case, a managed solution would not work because you can't edit components inside of a managed solution. It all depends on the architecture of your solutions, because you can architect them so you don't need to do the situation I just talked about. The next option, Azure DevOps pipelines. These provide, in my opinion, the ultimate flexibility to do whatever you want with the Power Platform ALM. And so essentially what you're going to do here is you're going to create your DevOps pipelines to automate any Power Platform solution-related ALM task. You can even create data source dependencies, such as SharePoint sites and lists that your Power Platform solutions rely upon. And I'm going to show you exactly how to do that in the next video or two. You can also store your solutions in source control with Azure DevOps pipelines. You can see it right here on the screen. On the bottom screenshot, I've got a folder structure where I'm putting my solutions in, and you can see the history of my solution and how it was added via a pipeline. I have every single thing I need, just like a regular professional DevOps project and developer with this integration. The other cool part is you really can literally extend the ALM to any processor system you want, because the DevOps pipelines are so flexible and allow us to invoke any type of code we want that we write or that someone else writes. So what's good and bad about the pipelines? There's a lot of things good about them. They are a really good fit for situations where you have many devs and or many Power Platform solutions. And why is that? Well, it's because they automate things so much. If you have a lot of people developing and a lot of solutions to push from one environment to another as they're tested and then eventually go to production, you're going to need to automate that or it's going to slow you down. And so that's why they're a great fit for this. As I mentioned before, I really feel that these have the ultimate flexibility to integrate with any process and system. So no matter if you're using DevOps or Jira or whatever you have to track your projects, you can do coordination between the two in here. This approach also allows you to stay what I like to call ahead of the game while the Power Platform pipelines evolve. You know, these Power Platform pipelines are awesome that I'm about to show you, and they're something we've all wanted for a long time. I'm very thankful they're here, but they're not done yet. And so as these Power Platforms pipelines evolve that Microsoft is making, there are still gaps in them. And you can fill these gaps with Azure DevOps quite easily. I think that most people who are using Azure DevOps pipelines right now may over time transition to use the out-of-the-box Power Platform pipelines and then keep around some of their DevOps pipeline pieces until the Power Platform pipelines catch up. Other pros that are real quick to talk about, they're consistent, they're fast. As I mentioned, we've got full source control. And with this, we can roll back to a previous version with just a couple clicks of kicking off a pipeline. So what's bad about them? Well, they do take longer to set up and plan than the manual approach that I talked about or the out-of-the-box Power pipelines. Another way to put it is they're not really citizen dev friendly. Citizen devs really aren't used to the things you need to do to configure DevOps to talk to your Power Platform environment, as well as thinking through some of the other things that are more DevOps and pro dev specific. Now, I'm certainly not putting down citizen devs here. I'm just saying they don't have the background to be familiar with DevOps usually that would make it easy for them to set this up. Whereas a pro dev who's familiar with all the pieces in DevOps, it'll be a little bit less of a learning curve for them. The things that do take the most time to set up and plan are the authentication and authorization between DevOps and the Power Platform environments, as well as the repository structure that you put in place. You saw on the previous slide how I had a repository structure I created to handle ALM and Power Platform. You're welcome to duplicate that as you see me do it in the subsequent videos and learn more about it, or you're welcome to create your own. But one way or the other, you do have to put thought into that, and it takes time to define it because you're making up that structure, and Microsoft's not telling you, here's a pattern you should use to do it. There's another part about the Azure DevOps pipelines, which is something you need to do manually. There's these things called JSON deployment settings files. And basically what it is a JSON file, and that JSON describes the solution. And it describes that solution so far as saying, here are the environment variables and the different connections that my solution relies upon. The neat part about this JSON structure is it actually points to individual instances of environment variables and connections within each environment. And so this is the file that is used to make your solutions portable, if you will, between like a dev, test, QA, and production environment. You would have one JSON file per environment, and you would edit the values in that environment to connect your Power Platform solution to the appropriate connections and environment variables. Another way to think of this file, if you come from a web development background, is the web.config file you would find in ASP.NET with the app settings inside of it. These are essentially the same thing that allow you to be portable from environment to environment. The next ones are the Power Platform pipelines. Now, this is the fun new approach. And as I mentioned, I've been playing with this one for a few months now, and I just couldn't believe it the first time I did it. And I was just so happy how easy it made my life to do some of the basic ALM things we need to do, from moving a solution to one place to another and setting up connections and environment variables on the fly in a dynamic fashion. Now, these pipelines are here to stay. This is brand new in the platform, and we're just going to see it evolve over and over, I'm sure, as time goes by. So what's cool about these pipelines is they're built in. They are built into the platform, so really setting them up is easy. But right now, they're brand new, right? They're in public preview. So they don't cover every single ALM need that you may have in your organization yet. Down the road, there are plans to cover tons of things in them, as well as extensibility points, which we can all look forward to. So as we think about Power Platform pipelines and what's good and bad about them, well, there's a lot of pros, as you can see here. They're native to the Power Platform, which really eases the setup for citizen devs. It is a good fit for situations where you have many developers and many Power Platform solutions. You know what? It's also a good fit if you just have one developer and a couple Power Platform solutions. In the future, these pipelines will have the flexibility to integrate with any process and system. And so Microsoft will share more about that down the road and the specifics on how they're going to do that. They are consistent, and boy, are they fast. They're just as fast as a DevOps pipeline because under the hood, they're using the Power Apps CLI, just like the components that we use inside of DevOps pipelines. They get updated automatically. You don't have to go, run an update or download an update or rev these things or change your code at all. For the DevOps pipelines, so far there's been one revision of the Power Apps build tools for DevOps. So that required a slight revision inside of my pipelines there. Only took a few minutes really, beyond the testing, took even longer than the revision. But the point is I had to make an update to those things, whereas here you'll never have to do that. These pipelines also support rolling back to the previous version. And they have solution dependency validation and a visualization aspect to them, which is very handy as you deploy things from environment to environment. Now, these cons here that I have, keep in mind, they're temporary, and they're also things you can work around by building a hybrid solution for your ALM. So right now, they don't have any integration with source control. And the setup and planning time, it takes a little bit longer than the manual approach. Not a whole lot though. You can set them up in just an hour or two following some simple instructions. We don't even have to write any code. You just configure stuff inside your Power Platform environment and they're ready to go. That brings us to the ALM Accelerator for Power Platform. Wow, this thing is crazy cool. It's been around for a long time and growing and growing. And Mike and the other guys on the team do such a fantastic job with it. This is an incredible end-to-end ALM solution, and it's a really awesome open source learning example as well. So not only do you have pipelines in this, but you have an entire suite of tools that everyone's built. And these tools and processes allow you to automate Power Platform solution ALM tasks. Here you can see a couple examples of the different tools that are used to configure the ALM Accelerator. So they created actual Power Apps that are used to configure, administer, and use the ALM Accelerator. It's extremely extensible. It's very complicated. And the reason it's complicated is because it does a lot of stuff. There is a lot to doing the ALM. And if you want to learn all the nitty-gritties on all the little pieces you could possibly do with it, this is a great sample for you. Now, what's good and bad about it? Well, the pros for it is, again, it's a good fit where you've got many developers and many Power Platform solutions. I think it's really would not be needed at all for a small shop with just a couple Power Apps or solutions in Power Platform or just one developer. It would really be overkill for that. But it is an incredible learning resource, as I mentioned. If you want to figure out how to do anything related to ALM and all the intricacies of it, this is where you can go find out how Microsoft is doing it under the hood. It's a giant code sample, and it also has great ideas and patterns you can repurpose and use. You can totally use this exactly out of the box as well. It just has so much stuff in it for a very robust ALM process, and it really takes a long time to really come to know it inside and out very well. The cons on it is the setup and planning time. It does take longer than the other approaches. I've set them all up. I've planned them all out. I've implemented them all. We've compared and contrasted them, and different people are using different versions of this that I work with. And definitely this one took me the longest to set up. I do have to be fair though and say when I set this up, it was less mature than it is now. And so a lot of the bugs and issues that I faced during setup, I did help submit those to GitHub, and I know they've been fixed. So it should be a much smoother setup experience now. And I've even seen people talking about that online. Even if it is smoother, though, it is more involved and it's bigger. So it will take you longer to set up than the other approaches. It's complicated, has many pieces, and it takes a while to understand it 100%. But with anything that is awesome, that's usually the case. You do need to update the ALM Accelerator for Power Platform yourself. It doesn't have, as far as I know, like an automatic Windows update type updating mechanism. So you just have to re-clone it to your system and then update configuration and deploy and things like that. So that is a look at all of the options. So now what we're going to do is we're going to start comparing them and seeing how do they fit in different situations. So I like to have a couple different ways to compare things. I have 2 slides worth of comparison charts. And this first one here is really comparing the most important ALM capabilities, or what I would consider, and other people probably consider too, core ALM capabilities that you have to have at a minimal to be successful with ALM. And so what are these? These are moving the solution to another environment, source control, deleting a solution, dynamic connections, connection references, environment variables. By dynamic connections, connection references, and environment variables, what I mean there is if I have a Power Platform solution in a development environment that is connected to different SharePoint lists than it would be when I deploy it to a production environment. And so dynamic connections means the ALM supports the ability to use the connection properly in dev, but when I deploy it to prod, it will use the appropriate connection to connect to the prod data source. The connection references are the same exact way when used inside of a flow, and the environment variables, no matter where you use them, they work and should change and be appropriate values for the environment that they live in. The ALM setup effort is also something I talked about on each pro and con slide, and the deployment effort here as well. So the deployment effort is different than the setup effort. So what I mean by ALM setup effort is how much effort do you put into putting this type of ALM approach into your organization? So the manual approach is hardly any time. You just start going through the motions to do it. But as I mentioned, the ALM Accelerator for Power Platform, that has the highest amount of effort on any of these approaches. So how does that differ from deployment effort? Well, deployment effort here, I'm really thinking of deploying an individual solution from environment to environment one time. That's what I'm measuring here. So, and what I'm talking about. So for manual, it's high, as I mentioned, right? You have to click and type everything to make that whole thing work. But for DevOps and Power Pipelines, you click one thing and the whole thing just goes. ALM Accelerator for Power Platform, it has more gates. It's more formal. It has a lot of different things in it, like approvals and things you can do with it. So it has more of a medium deployment effort associated with it. You can also see the roles that I feel personally that it's best suited for. Manual and DevOps and Power Pipelines all can be accomplished by citizen dev to a degree. I think DevOps, I have crossover with Pro Dev there because I think it's helpful to have someone who's familiar with Visual Studio set it up. But after that, and it's set up and ready to go, I don't see any reason or hangups on why a citizen dev couldn't kick off a pipeline or something like that to move their solution from one place to another, or to take their solution and place it into DevOps, for example. So those are the different pieces of the puzzle there that I'm evaluating it on. And as you look through them, you can just see which ones would be better for whatever you need to do and the size of your organization and what to expect or what they do good. Now, as we come down and look at it another way, how do these options fit different situations? So here I kind of broke it down in some common places and factors that I see considered as we help people with ALM. And the first one we find out a lot of times is just, what's the size of your team? Depending on the size of your team and how much you're developing on Power Platform and what your cadence is, different solutions or approaches here make more sense than another. For example, the one-person team, a great fit for manual and Power Pipeline, but not for DevOps and ALM Accelerator, as I pointed out. Now, when I have low governance and high governance here, what I'm talking about is how much governance do you need in the ALM process? For example, if you're in a small company and you don't belong to any industry that has a bunch of rules around data retention or who touched what or audit logs and things like that, maybe you have a Power App for like your little business of something real fun like owning a ice cream shop, right? Maybe it's a mobile ordering ice cream shop app. Well, I don't know a ton of regulations about that, but if I had an app that I was deploying for a banking institution, all of a sudden there's a whole ton of governance that needs to go along with that deployment. So that's the difference between low governance and high governance. So if we look at an example here, I'm saying, is a manual approach low governance? Yes, it fits very well with that. But does manual approach fit really good with high governance? No, absolutely not, because it's very hard to audit all the actions and who did what in a manual deployment. However, on the other hand, if you use DevOps or Power Platform Accelerator for ALM or the Power Pipelines, those are great fit for high governance because they have capabilities baked into them to audit all the actions that take place during deployments. The final column here of effort is, what is the overall effort here to do a deployment? It's pretty similar to what we talked about in the other slide there. So manual, high effort, DevOps, that's real low effort. Power Pipelines, medium effort to stand this up and get it up and running and use it in your organization. And the Accelerator for Power Platform, in my opinion, is the highest level of effort required and the most expertise to get it going. So now that you've seen all those, it's up to you to choose the ones that are going to work best for your organization. So how do I suggest going about this in your journey with the Power Platform? Start simple, understand the concepts, use a manual deployment first, just one time at least. This will help you understand, what does it mean when I import a Power Platform solution? What does it mean when I export one? What is a connection? What is a connection reference? What is an environment variable? How do those play into a manual deployment will teach you what they all are and how you update them and where they sit in the platform. This will give you the knowledge and the baseline groundwork in your head to understand, okay, I see all the pieces of the puzzle I need to do. I understand them. Now I can focus on how to automate them and make them easier for me. I think it would be very hard to try to automate first when you don't even know everything that works. And that's why I recommend starting with the manual. So after you do the manual deployment, then you can say, okay, what do I need or want to automate here? And then prioritize it. Start on the things that are the most important to automate and get them done. See how things are going. Maybe you find that's enough automation for your process and you don't actually need to go to the other things on your list. Maybe you need to get everything done on your list. You'll know that better than me, but get your list prioritized and then go from there. Then determine which approaches are going to meet your needs. As I mentioned, you can combine them. There's no correct path. Everyone listening to this video will have a different situation and be slightly different, and maybe this or that approach is better for you. After you figure out which approaches you think will meet your need, make a roadmap for it. Even if you don't have to implement the ALM Accelerator for Power Platform, use it as part of your roadmap. Maybe you don't need to install it, but go watch a video on it. They have great videos that show you everything it can do and how to install it. As part of your roadmap, go look at that, because it's going to inspire you. It's going to inspire you on processes that you may not have thought about that you want inside of your ALM. And it's also just a huge code sample that can help you out. Maybe it'll work for you all by itself. Maybe you want to take pieces of it and put them into your own pipelines like I have done. Whatever the best fit for you is, you'll find it, I'm sure. Take your time with this. This is not something, I can tell you right now, that you're going to start on today and finish in 2 months. If you do one of the more complicated options like the Azure DevOps pipelines or the ALM Accelerator kit. If you're in a really big organization and there's a lot of actors at play, and you have like a rigorous IT process where lots of different people participate in the development, testing, and deployment, take your time, map it all out, and test. Don't just test it with the good old "it works on my machine" approach of you test everything with one global admin account. Make sure, if you have different people who are involved in the development and deployment, that you create accounts that simulate the people in real life and use those accounts and their rights and their permissions to walk through the deployment process. You will find things, depending on your approach, that certain users, if they do one thing in the process, they need to do another as well. I'm not going to get deep into that right now in this overview video, but I bring it up because if you don't really adequately test this stuff, you will find some gotchas when you get to production, and nobody wants that to happen. So this does it for my intro video on how to choose a different or which Power Platform ALM approach is good for you. My subsequent videos then are going to dive into each one of these approaches and show you a demo of me deploying the solutions using those approaches, and tell you all about it and how you can build them yourself. So thanks for watching. I hope you got a lot out of this, and I will see you next time.